Hi everybody, I'm Jackson E. Graham, author of the Sword and Scion series. Now, we've all heard the saying, write what you know. But as someone with not a lot of life experience, how can I write about anything? Well, it takes a lot of reading and a lot of research, so some of what I write is informed by what I read. Tonight, I'm going to give you an inside look at some of my research process. Tonight, I'm going to be reading aloud some sections from Sword and Scion Book 1, Into the Dark Mountains. She waited. Rumors had come, telling of a trespasser on Baron Daneth's personal hunting grounds. Perched in the limb of an oak, her emerald green eyes scrutinized the forest. To her right, she caught sight of a squirrel darting among the bushes. Eyes set for bigger prey, she paid no heed to the small creature and resumed her search. Braided and tied atop her head, her curly copper-red hair was smeared with mud in an effort to conceal her position. Dark green clothing melted into a multitude of leaves, sheltering her from prying eyes. An old, L-shaped scar on her cheekbone glistened in the sunlight. She glowed with the light of youth and vitality. Fingering her bow, the young elf tuned her ears to any sound, alert to all that stirred below her. Suddenly, she paused, eyes riveted to a section of nearby brush. A large stick broke under the weight of an unseen intruder. Muscles tensed to pounce, she stared intently at the place of reference, waiting for the source of sound to emerge. For several seconds, nothing appeared. A man stumbled out of the brush, sword clenched in hand. The young elf leapt from the oak, landing in front of the intruder. Pulling an arrow from her quiver with astonishing speed, she drew the bowstring to her cheek, aimed directly at his heart. Shocked, the man swung his blade at her, clumsily missing his target. Carried by the momentum of his blow, he spun on his heels, falling into the underbrush on his sword arm. Unflinching at this awkward strike, the elf stared at her fallen quarry. His long black hair lay disheveled over his features, and coarse stubble covered his chin. The man stared back toward his captor, his gaze wild and tormented. He could not be more than 17 years of age. "These are the Baron's private hunting grounds. State your name and business here," she commanded, her voice steady. At the mention of the Baron, the man's face lightened, for only a moment. "Flames! Blood!" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the young elf to hear. Before she could answer, the young man laid his head back, unconscious. She dropped to his side, replacing her arrow and slinging her bow onto her back. Laying her hand on his shoulder, she shook him in an attempt to wake him, without success. The glint of the sun on the man's sword drew her eye. The weapon seemed familiar. Pensively, she pulled the sword from his hand, bringing it up to the sunlight. As she took in the fine craftsmanship, a gleam of recognition dawned in her eyes. Her hand flew to her mouth, vision blurring with lightheadedness. How did this weapon get into this man's possession? Who is he? The young elf returned the blade to its scabbard. She retrieved several fallen limbs and brought them to where the man lay. Setting them on the ground, she constructed a travois, lashing the limbs together with vines from a nearby bush. Satisfied with her work, the elf set the structure parallel to the victim and kneeled. Splayed in an uncomfortable position, the man's left arm was loosely tucked into his belt, bruised and deformed. A broken forearm. Carefully, she laid the arm upon the young man's chest, slipping a straight piece of wood underneath the broken limb. Setting a similar piece atop the man's arm, she fastened the splint with the cords that bound her hair. Once she had finished, she rolled him onto his good side, sliding the travois underneath him. Jolted by the move, the man incoherently muttered to himself. Setting the man down, she adjusted his dangling limbs, crossing his legs and setting his right arm on his chest to keep him from slipping off. Gently, she hoisted the small end of the travois onto her shoulders and looked west. Through the trees, a gaping cave could be seen on the mountainside. It will suffice. With a deep breath, she trudged toward the cave, hoping for answers. So this travois scene is a perfect example of my research process. I originally had decided to give Aeolus a dislocated shoulder, but it turns out that that is something that one person cannot fix alone. So I eventually decided, well, let's give him a compound fracture. But then there was the risk of infection, and in medieval times, most likely that would end up in you being dead. So I eventually settled on a closed fracture. And now, for the second reading. Gwendol took several dried mint leaves from a jar by the window and dropped them into the mortar. Taking the pestle in hand, she ground the leaves into a powder, the crisp scent of mint cooling her nostrils. She sprinkled a few drops of fresh water from a leather pouch into the mortar, mixing the solution into a thick poultice. Once finished, she brought it to Aeolus' bedside and smeared it on his disfigured forearm. The color was returning to his face. The rest has done him well. Gwendol took a fresh cloth and wrapped it around his arm, setting it on his chest. The cool touch of the herbs would alleviate his pain somewhat. Roused by her treatment, Aeolus opened his droopy eyes and yawned. Gwendol smiled. "Wait a moment," she insisted, exiting the cabin. Shutting the door behind her, Gwendol descended the ladder. She stooped to gather several small, dry basalt stones. The sunlight had already warmed their smooth surface, ever the better for the task at hand. She set them aside, collecting dead branches and placing them into a pile as she withdrew her fire-stealing flint. As she struck the two together repeatedly, sparks lit the charcloth. She lifted the smoking material in cupped hands, gently blowing through pursed lips to coax the flame to life, and released it into the gathered tinder. Flames licked upward, weaving through the mass of dry brush. One at a time, Gwendol placed the rocks into the fire. She stood, returning with a small drinking vessel and pair of wooden tongs from the cabin. Water sloshed audibly within, rippling as she set the cup by the fire. Smoothed by extensive use, the tips of the tongs were charred by the flames of past fires. Plucking a stone from the coals with the tongs, Gwendol dropped it into the vessel, the water hissing in annoyance. She placed the tongs by the fireside, retrieving a handful of dried flowers from a leather pouch on her belt. After dropping the petals into the steaming flask, she waited for it to steep. Hearing Gwendol return, Aeolus opened his eyes. Removing the stopper from the vessel, she walked to his bedside. Steam rose from the flask in her hand. Aeolus sighed. "Something for me to drink." He reached out to take it from her. Holding the cup out of reach, Gwendol shook her head. "Arnica is toxic if taken internally," she interjected. Taking another clean cloth from the box underneath the bed, she soaked it in the tea. She set the vessel on the nightstand, removing the dripping cloth and tying the compress onto Aeolus' broken arm. Drops of liquid rolled down his elbow as the solution did its work. "This should help your body reabsorb any bleeding and cut down healing time to a few months," she explained. "Until then, it will have to be immobilized." Taking a long section of cloth, she wrapped it around his wounded arm and tied it behind his head. So I did some research into herbal remedies and decided on arnica, which, as you probably gathered from the story, is for external use only. It helps reabsorb body fluids, cuts healing time in half, and reduces nerve swelling and pressure. So I also tried the mint poultice. I actually made one and tried it on myself, and it did act as a cooling agent, so that's where that experience came into play. So research comes into play for my name-making process as well. So typically I will take a word that correlates to a character's personality trait and put it into Google Translate and search through the languages trying to find out which ones I like and which ones I could spin off of. However, for every name I Google it to make sure that nothing is previously used or associated with anything inappropriate. So also for a short story that I wrote, which is actually set in the golden age of piracy, I do like historical fiction as well as fantasy, I actually went and rode on an actual tall ship. So check out Gray's Harbor Historical Seaport. I rode on the Hawaiian Chieftain. It was super cool because you could feel the ocean spray hitting your face, the waves surging underneath the ship, and we even had a fake pirate attack, so that was pretty fun. So be sure to check them out. Thanks for coming, everybody, and I hope you all have a great night. If you want to see any more content about behind-the-scenes looks at my writing, be sure to subscribe to this channel. Thanks for coming tonight, everybody, and I all hope you have a great night.
And I all hope.
I swear I have dyslexia sometimes.